Hey, what is up guys, Simon here, and welcome back to part 2 of the Let's Build a Game series. In this video, I'd like to set up version control with Git, set up unit tests with nspec, and start implementing the first features in a test-driven way. Before we dive into it, let's just recap what we've done in part 1. So in part 1, we created a new Unity project, downloaded Entitas from the Unity asset store, and created a game controller as an entry point to our application. The game controller creates two systems, one initialize system that creates an entity with a health of 100, and a second reactive system that logs the health changes to the Unity console. All right. Now let's continue from here. First of all, I'd like to save the scene and give it a name, game scene. And I'd like to clean up a little bit. So usually I'd like to have a folder called libraries where I store all my third-party libraries. And I will move Entitas in there. And now that I moved Entitas, I'd like to make sure if the code generator still works. So I navigate into our project root, and I've created an alias called Jenny. So whenever I write Jenny, it expands to what I've used in the first video, mono Jenny Jenny exe. So I can write Jenny doctor. And I see there are some warnings already. So this is really easy to fix by just running auto import again. And I choose Roslyn and Roslyn. Great. So if I run doctor now, the warnings are gone. But I'd like to show you how you can make the code generation part independent from the location of Entitas. So therefore, I just run the edit command to open the properties. And we see the search paths here. And we see it added two new search paths, assets, library, Entitas. This is where we just moved Entitas to. And it used to be in assets, Entitas. So now we can actually remove those paths because they are not used anymore. And if we take a look, the Desperate Devs and Entitas plugins are also available in the Jenny plugins folder. I see we have Desperate Devs, Entitas, and Roslyn. So we can just use them instead. And save it. And now we're basically independent from the location of Entitas. Let's try this. Run doctor. There are no warnings. That means we can easily generate now and everything should work. Next, let's set up version control, and I will use Git for that. And I strongly recommend to use any kind of version control system. Even if you work alone, it can save your days. So I will initialize a new Git repository with the git init command. And then open it in SourceTree, which is a free Git client. I already prepared the git ignore off screen, so here it is. The git ignore contains patterns of files that I'd like to ignore. So quick check, looks all good to me, great. So I can just commit everything and call it initial commit. So I'm on the master branch, here's my commit, here are my files. Personally, I also like to set up git flow, which is the set of conventions. And I will just initialize git flow with the default conventions. So git flow changed the branch to develop now for me, and I'm ready to go. Great. So now we can set up unit tests. There are different ways how to do the unit testing. Personally, I strongly recommend not to use Unity test tools or the Unity test runner, because at some point it will just take too long to write and run the tests, and we definitely want to avoid this. Instead, I recommend having a separate test project outside of the assets folder that references your project so we can build and run the tests quickly. Now let's do this by creating a new test project. So I will create a new console application and call it tests, and I will just save it in the root of my project. Next, I'd like to set up unit tests in my project. Therefore, I will just copy and paste what I have in Entitas repository already. So here's the Entitas repository. In the libraries folder, you will find nspec, the nspec runner, and the NUnit framework. I happen to have Entitas on my machine already, so I will just copy and paste nspec, nspec runner, and the NUnit framework and paste it into my test project in a folder called libraries. I'd also like to copy and paste the test runner from the Entitas project. So I will just navigate to the test runner, copy, and paste it here in the test project. So now I can just add the existing file, the test runner. I don't need the program anymore. Now we have missing references. So let's manage our references and add all of these 3 assemblies. Great. So if you run it, we see 0 examples, 0 failed, 0 pending. Let's create our first unit test and see if everything is set up correctly. Therefore, I will create a folder tests where I drop all my tests. And I will create the first test. This will be a private class derived from nspec. nspec is convention driven, so if you want to learn more about the syntax, just go to nspec.org. You will find all you need to know to get started. I will skip this step because I think it's pretty straightforward. There are some conventions, for example, methods have to start with when, and then, for example, testing. And now I can add all my tests here. I will create 2 tests, one that fails, so I can say false should be true. And this is basically the syntax. You have objects or values, and you can just call methods like should be true, should be null, or should be 7 or something like that. Then I will create another test which works. And I will say true should be true. Now let's run this again. And I see describe tests. When testing, one fails and the other works. So everything works fine. As a last step, I'd like to call this test from the terminal. You can definitely run it in the IDE, but I got used to run the tests in the terminal. So I prepare the tests sh. If we take a look real quick, it just builds the test project solution, and then it just executes the test exe with additional parameters. That's all it does. So now I can just say test sh, run it, and I'll get the same output. One fails, the other works. Great. And to start adding the first features, we finally need to import our actual game project. I will add an existing project, which is our assembly C#. So now I have access to our systems, to the game controller, and basically everything that we wrote earlier. Now we have to reference this project in the test project, and I will just make the IDE help me by just saying game controller, and Writer offers me to import assembly C#. Great. Now it's referenced. We can see here. And let's start writing our first test. And the first feature I'd like to do is a health system that flags all entities as destroyed whenever the health is 0 or less. And before I start, I'd like to tell you the rules that I'm following for this video. First of all, I'm only allowed to write any production code when either, number 1, the code is not compiling, or number 2, the tests are failing. The next rule is more like a convention. So my tests will have a certain setup. They will have 3 parts. First of all, the given state. So you set up any given state, for example, I equals 0. Then you have the when phase, where you execute some logic, for example, I plus equals 1. And finally, you have the assertion phase, where you assert, for example, I should be 1. So if we run this real quick, yeah, adds 1. That works. Great. And this is basically the setup for all my tests. All right, let's start. Describe health system. when executing, it flags entities as destroyed when health is 0. Now, the given state, we create a system, which is the health system. And I always pass the context in my system, so I create a context as well. Great. So now I'm allowed to write production code because the code is not compiling. We need to create a health system, so let's do this. And this will be a reactive system. Let's make it compile. Health. Personally, I never test the trigger and I never test the filter. Those are basically just configuration for me. The only thing I want to test is the execute or the initialize and initialize system. Feel free to test the trigger and filter if you like that, but for me, again, I consider it as configuration. So let's split the view and have them side by side. What else do we need to set up? We need an entity and add a health. And we're testing when health is 0, so we add 0. We also have to add a reference to entitas. Great. Now, when we execute the system, then I assert that the entity is destroyed. We don't have this component yet, so let's add it real quick. And since we are in a new project, I also have to set up the shortcut real quick to call the generator. So I quickly do the very same thing I've done in the last video. Allocate genex, use client gen as an argument, set the working directory to our root, and I don't have to build the project before. I also uncheck this so that when I generate this tool window in the bottom of the IDE won't appear all the time. Then let's start the server again or make sure it has been started. Now we can generate. When I go back to the tests, we have access to the component and this should be true. Now let's run the tests. And as expected, it doesn't work because we haven't wrote any code yet. So let's make this test pass. And there's another rule. I will only add the simplest code I can imagine to make the test pass. So I try not to think too much. And the easiest thing to make this test work, it should be destroyed. So I will just say entity is destroyed equals true. That's the simplest thing I can imagine. Run the tests. And it works. Great. Let's add another test. Flags entities as destroyed when health is less than 0. So again, we create a context, we have the system, we create the entity, and now the health should be less than 0. We execute the system, and now we can assert it should be destroyed. Let's run it. Great. So I clean up real quick. And since everything compiles and all the tests pass, I take a look if I can already clean up something or refactor something. The system looks great, but here in the tests I see some duplicated code. We create a context in the system and we do it here again. So let's refactor this real quick. And instead of doing this in every test itself, we can just move this code into a before block, and everything in the before block will be executed before we run each test. So I grab this real quick, put it here, and split the variables. Great. So I can remove it here, and I can remove it here, because when we enter this test, the before block is executed, so we have access to all of those variables. Looks nice already, so is there anything else? I don't see anything to refactor or clean up. Great, so let's add the next test. It doesn't flag entities as destroyed when health is greater than 0. So let's say at health +1, we execute the system and I assert that it's not destroyed, so it should be false. So let's run the tests. And it fails. So what's the simplest thing to make this work? It shouldn't be destroyed, so we can just say false, run the tests. And this test is passing, but now both of the others fail. And now I actually have to start using my brain a little bit and make all of them pass. All right, so in this case, it's really simple to do. We just check if the entity health value is less or equals than 0. And if it is, we destroy it. And it works. Great. Now everything compiles, everything passes. Let's see what we can do. First of all, we access health here. So I'd like to ensure that we have health. Is there anything else? I don't see anything. Great. So we can close it. The tests are also cleaned up. Great. Now let's finally use our health system in our actual game. So I go to the root systems and add it to the list. I also just changed my mind. I'd like to call root systems game systems. So I quickly rename this. And when I grab the health component and change it to a value less than 0, we will see a destroyed component got added automatically. Great. So let's do this again. If I change this to 0, as we just tested in a unit test, it will add this component. Great. Now let's add the second feature. I'd like to add a feature that actually destroys all entities that are flagged with the destroy component. So let's just copy paste this test real quick and call it describe destroy entity system. And let's create this system. We don't have it, so we have to add it to make it compile. And for this system, I'd like to take a normal execute system instead of a reactive system. Both will work, but let's just use an execute system for that. I split it, so we have the system on the right and the tests on the left. And the first test will be destroys entity flagged with destroy. So again, the setup would be creating a new entity, which we have already, and we flag it with is destroyed. Now, when we execute the system, I assert that the entity is not enabled anymore, so it should be false. Let's run the test. And we see the previous tests and also the new ones. If you want, you can also just pass the name of the test as an argument, and it will focus on this test only. But I will just execute all of them all the time. So what's the simplest thing to do? I will just iterate over all the entities and mark them destroyed. So we'll get the entities and call destroy. Great. Let's add another test. Doesn't destroy entities not flag destroy. So we're just not flagging it. And it should be enabled. So it should be true. And it doesn't work because it also got destroyed. So the simplest thing to do would be use the game matcher destroyed and only destroy those. And I also like to do another test real quick, and I'd like to see if the context entity count actually is 0 in this case. This means the entity got destroyed and is removed from the context. And here I'd like to see if the count is still 1 and the entity hasn't been destroyed. Great. So again, everything compiles, all the tests pass. Let's see if we can do something. First of all, I'd like to store this in a group to save one method call. So I will say context game get group, make it read only, and now we can just iterate over this group. This will probably not work. Let's see if it works. It doesn't, because we were iterating over a collection and we were modifying this collection while iterating. And as we know, we can't do this because what happens, we're iterating over group, but then we destroy the entity, and groups are always up to date. So this call will remove the entity from the group, but we can't modify the group because we're iterating over it. That's easy to fix by just calling get entities, which will return an array which is safe to iterate over. Great. So we can remove the context here. All right. So the system looks nice and tight. We get a group, we iterate over it and destroy it. Great, so I can close this. Let's see if we can do something here. Looks nice and tight as well. But if I compare both of the systems, the health system and the destroy entity system, we see duplicated code again. So let's fix this as well by adding a new file called Entitas test. And this will be a private class that derives from nspec. And this will just contain some common logic. So let's see, we have the context, system, and entity. Let's just grab the context and move it out already. And also, I'd like to create a systems wrapper where I can add all the systems to and execute or initialize them. Great. So let's start with the health system and derive from Entitas test. That means we can remove the context, we can remove the system. We have to call setup before. We can remove this. We can make this a variable and then just add it to the systems. And call systems execute everywhere. All right, let's run the tests. And everything still works. Then let's do the same thing with the destroy entity test. I can remove the context, the system, context, make this a variable. And add the system to the systems. Great. And I forgot to call the setup. Everything works. Awesome. So let's compare the tests again. So it looks great to me. There's less duplicated code. The tests are nice and simple. So let's see our new system in action and add it to the game systems list. And to show you what kind of structure I'm aiming for in the game systems, I can already add some comments. In a general game loop, I have the following phases. Initialization. Then I will query for user input. I will update the simulation. I will update the views or render the views. And finally, I will do some cleanup. This is a basic game loop. So let's sort our systems already. The create player definitely is an initialization system. Log health will be update. The health system is update, and destroy entity system is in cleanup. Great. So let's go to Unity and run the scene. So when I grab the health and reduce it to 0 or less, I expect this entity will be destroyed immediately. So let's do this. And it's gone. We see it has been pushed back to the reusable entities. Let's create a new one and add the destroyed component, and it will immediately be destroyed again. And there it goes. Great. And let's go to source tree and commit our changes. Earlier, I forgot to commit the health system. So now we'll just commit everything in one commit. Great. To summarize, we initialize Git as our version control system. We set up unit tests with nspec, and we implemented the first two features in a test-driven way. As always, you can get the latest version at the official GitHub repository. Make sure to hit like if you liked the video and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.